Why the heck is learning so hard? Well, it is hard. We can't get away from that. And in this video, I want to start to unpack why it is hard and what makes it unavoidably hard. Why can, no matter what you do, not erase completely what makes learning as a human being hard. I'm Dave Stewart. I write books for teachers. I teach students every day in a 9th grade history and English classroom. And I'm grateful to be with you today talking about the unavoidable difficulties of learning and what we can do about them. To help us, we're going to use Dr. Stephen Chew's beautifully concise graphic of the choke points and pitfalls for learning. So on your screen right now, we have the human learning system. And you can see that what we're trying to do is get things from the left-hand side of the screen over to the right-hand side of the screen in a way that can be pulled to the middle-ish of the screen. So let me just break it down. Every single moment that we're conscious, there are a bajillion things that our senses could potentially be taking in. But because of the limited scope of attention, we can only pay attention to so many things that are in our environment. Once things get through the attentional filter, we now have to deal with working memory. Working memory is the stuff that you currently have in mind, the things that you're currently thinking about. And so we can be thinking about some of those things from our external world that we're paying attention to, but we can also be thinking about some of the things that are already in our long-term memory. And the problem with working memory is that it is very, very limited. We're going to talk more about this in a second. So let's move on to long-term memory. This is the goal of learning. We want to get stuff in our classes, from our instruction, from the articles our students read, from the experiments we have them run. We want to get things from there into long-term memory and then be able to get that stuff back out of long-term memory and use it to solve problems, think critically, and so on. So that's the human learning system. It's not too bad, right? I mean, that's pretty simple. What we're trying to do, no big deal. But let's talk about what Stephen Chew calls choke points. So all 4 of these choke points are unavoidable difficulties of learning. They just do exist. You can't get rid of them, but you can work with them. You can partner with these realities in a way that makes them way less obstacle-y than they need to be. We don't want things to be more obstacle-y than they need to be, do we? So choke point number 1 is that mental effort or concentration is a limited resource. In other words, no matter how smart you are, no matter how behind you are, there's still a finite amount of energy that you can bring to the learning task at hand. No one can concentrate forever. Albert Einstein couldn't concentrate forever. Dave Stewart, definitely that I can't concentrate forever. My 9th grade students can't concentrate forever, but I've been working on concentration longer, and so I typically can concentrate longer than my average student, and I bet Albert Einstein could concentrate longer on average than I can. So this is like a developable strength, just like the strength of your bicep or your quadriceps are developable strengths. You can make your muscles more capable of putting forth more effort through the right kind of work, and so too with your concentration. But the best thing that you can do, and this is on Stephen Chew's graphic, is to overlearn core material. So a great example of this would be becoming fluent at decoding. In the early grades of school, we're helping students to understand the code of the written language that they're trying to read, and then to become fluent in decoding that language and turning it into the type of language that we grow up being used to. We grow up being used to verbal language. So decoding a written text into something that we can think about, into a verbal language, making that fluent is what Chew is describing when he says overlearning. Another example of this would be multiplication facts. We do want our students to understand what the multiplication facts are about, just like we want our students to understand what the words mean that they're decoding, right? So this is why some people say you shouldn't just have kids memorize multiplication facts. You need them to understand what multiplication is. Great, true. But there just is a point where memorizing multiplication facts to the point of automaticity greatly advantages you, because now when you encounter a multiplication issue in a higher level math class, you don't have to sit there and exert effort to figure out the multiplication fact. You don't have to work the problem because the product of that multiplication fact is just there. It's just ready. So that's what he's getting at with overlearning. Choke point number 2 is that attentional focus is very narrow. Human beings are not capable to pay attention to multiple things at a time. There's just only so much that you can pay attention to. It's quite a filter. It does this, pretty severe angles on the filter angle. And so the way around this is to try to minimize the distractions in your classroom. I call this a distraction tax. And the question that I can ask myself with each lesson is, what distraction taxes am I enacting on my students? So for example, if you have your students all seated in groups, that might be really conducive to some modes of learning that you have in your classroom. But I can tell you that setting a 14-year-old across from a 14-year-old and asking them to both look at me while giving some instruction, there is a distraction tax there. There is just going to be this niggling sense inside of their mind that they want to look at this cute person across the way or this annoying person across the way or whatever. So this is one example of a distraction tax, a thing that can cause students to have to put forth more of that limited effort, choke point number one, and that can eventually exhaust them and make them more easily distractible. And as they become distracted, now things that I want them to be paying attention to aren't getting through the attentional filter because instead they're just gazing at their buddy across the way. Or they're thinking about the off-topic tangent that I made because, of course, I think that I'm hilarious, but oh, what folly I have, because when I make off-topic tangential remarks that I think are hilarious, I am likely exacting a distraction tax on at least some of my learners that is activating this choke point, distracting them from what I want them to be paying attention to. So I got to limit my fun a little bit if I want to work with the human learning system. Next up, when we get past attention, now we're inside the mind and we're in working memory. And I mentioned this earlier and I'm going to mention it here again. The limited nature of working memory is a serious choke point in the human learning system. It is at play all the time, no matter what grade level you teach, because no matter how much training that you undertake, no matter how close to mastery your students get, they will always still have roughly 4 chunks inside of their working memory to work with. And so you can see in Stephen Chu's graphic, he says the solution is organizing information in a discipline into meaningful and useful chunks. And so this is why Albert Einstein, when he sees E equals mc squared, when he comes up with that equation, like to him, that the whole universe is contained within that equation because he has all of this background knowledge that he's amassed through years and years and years of study and thinking and creation. And so his chunks of working memory, his 4 chunks, let's say, they contain these huge bodies of background knowledge, huge constellations of ideas that he can work with at one time because all that information is organized in his mind. We as teachers have to help our learners to organize information. We need to think about how our units develop this sense of organized, chunked information in the mind, and we need to create activities in class that help students to continue to chunk this information. And so that's going to be super disciplinarily specific and beyond the scope of this video, but in my Principles of Learning course, I invite you, yes, you colleague, no matter what you teach, to come and think more about things like why learning is hard and how Stephen Chu's graphic looks when applied to our unique classes that we teach. So please consider joining that course. And if you do so during the month of March, guess what? You can get 10% off on the course by using coupon code Bieber because, of course, March begins with the birthday of Justin Bieber himself. He turned 30 this year. Does that make you feel old? I'm sorry. And then finally, the last choke point for learning, the last unavoidable difficulty of learning is that the mind is very efficient, and even long-term memory, with its massive capacity, does regularly prune itself of unused information. And so, to help our students to avoid forgetting, we want to create situations in class on a regular basis where they're retrieving information, where they practice pulling information for long-term memory, because that reduces the forgetting effect. The forgetting effect that, again, like all these choke points on the screen, is unavoidable. The mind does forget. Your students, when they forget things, they're not just being lazy, they're not being dumb or inadequate. Nope, they're being something much more hard to deal with, and that is a human being. And so you, colleague, and I, we have to create regular opportunities for our students to retrieve information from long-term memory so as to decrease the likelihood that it will be forgotten. These 4 things are what Stephen Chu calls choke points. They are bugs in the human learning system, you could say. So our goal is to turn those bugs into features, to turn those bugs into things that we regularly Craft learning experiences in classrooms, learning progressions that work with these aspects of the human learning system rather than closing our eyes and pretending that they don't exist, pretending that if we just teach well enough, our students won't forget. No, you have to teach in certain ways. You have to create certain types of experiences to make forgetting less likely to occur in your class, to make working memory something that works for your students rather than against, to make distraction tactics as minimal as possible, and to make the effort that your class requires actually achievable for your students. That's a lot to deal with, isn't it? That's a lot to deal with. Yep, that's why the first principle in my Principles of Learning course is that learning is hard. It is. But the good news is also it's not impossible. People do it every day, every single day. I bet they might even do it in your class. I think they do it in mine. And that's some good news. This is good work that we have, colleague. It's good, hard work that we have to do. And I want to argue that we should be grateful for it. Even though it's hard, it's good. It's beautiful. It's noble. It's timeless. So let's get after it. I'll see you next time. And actually in my next video, I'm going to talk about the avoidable difficulties of learning, because you'll notice on the screen here, there are some grayed out areas. Those are completely avoidable pitfalls, Stephen Chu calls them. We'll look at those in my next video. So, subscribe and stuff. That's how you can't miss the videos.